Texas, 1944. The afternoon sun pressed down on Camp Howze like a weight, turning dust to powder and steel to fire. Lieutenant Margaret Werner stood at the wire fence, hands gripping the mesh until her knuckles went white. Behind her, 36 German women waited in formation, silent except for their breathing. They had crossed an ocean in chains, expecting dungeons and darkness. Instead, they found mesquite trees and a sky too vast to comprehend. But today was different. Today, the Red Cross was coming, and Margot carried a secret that could destroy everything she had built in this strange, impossible place. Spring arrived late to North Texas in 1944, but when it came, it transformed the landscape overnight. Bluebonnets erupted across the fields surrounding Camp Howze, painting the ground in shades the German women had no English words for. The camp itself sat between Sherman and Gainesville, a sprawl of wooden barracks and administration buildings that housed over 20,000 prisoners of war. Most were men, German soldiers captured in North Africa and Italy. But in a separate compound on the eastern edge, behind additional fencing and guard towers, lived something the U.S. military had never dealt with before: female prisoners of war. They arrived in March on a train that had crossed half the continent. Margot Werner pressed her face against the window glass as Texas unfolded before her. The landscape was all wrong. Where she expected mountains, she found flatness. Where she expected cold, she found heat that made the air shimmer. Where she expected hatred, she found faces that looked almost bored. The train stopped at a siding outside Sherman. Guards opened the doors and sunlight flooded in, blinding after days of darkness. Margot was 32 years old, a former nurse from Hamburg, who had worked at a military hospital in occupied France. The resistance had captured her unit during the Allied advance. Now she stood on American soil, blinking in light so bright it hurt. They were placed on trucks for the final leg. The ride took 40 minutes through countryside that seemed endless. Cattle grazed in fields that stretched to the horizon. Farmhouses sat alone in an ocean of grass, each with windmills that turned slowly in the wind. Children waved from porches. One woman hung laundry on a line and paused to watch the convoy pass, one hand shielding her eyes. In the truck, the women sat without speaking. Most were nurses like Margot, but there were others: clerks, translators, a few who had worked in military kitchens or supply depots. The youngest was 19. The oldest was 56. They had expected barbarism. The propaganda ministry had prepared them for torture, for humiliation, for things they could barely name. Instead, they found roads and farms and a guard who offered them water from his canteen. Camp Howze materialized like a small city in the emptiness. Rows of barracks extended in neat grids, divided by roads of packed dirt. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, but the guards inside looked relaxed, almost casual. The truck stopped at the women's compound, a separate section surrounded by additional fencing. Inside stood 4 barracks buildings, a mess hall, a recreation area, and a small infirmary. The camp commander was a Colonel Pritchard, a man in his 50s with gray hair and a face that had seen too much sun. He addressed them through an interpreter, a German-American corporal named Schmidt, who spoke their language with a strange accent that mixed Berlin and Brooklyn. "Your stay here will be determined by the war's duration," Pritchard said. "You will work if you choose to work. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will not be mistreated. You will not be harmed." The women stood silent. They had heard promises before. That first night, Margot lay in her bunk and listened to someone crying softly in the darkness. Outside, crickets made sounds she had never heard before. The air smelled of dust and grass and something cooking in a distant kitchen. Through the window, stars filled the sky in numbers that seemed impossible. She thought of Hamburg, of the hospital where she had worked, of the French village where everything had ended. She thought of her husband, Klaus, somewhere in a Russian prison if he was still alive. She closed her eyes and waited for sleep that would not come. Days established themselves in patterns. They woke at 6 to the sound of a bell that echoed across the compound. Breakfast was served in the mess hall: oatmeal, bread, sometimes eggs, coffee that tasted like nothing they knew but was hot and strong. The portions were larger than anything they had seen in Germany for years. Some women cried the first time they saw the amount of food on their plates. They worked if they chose to. Most did. The alternative was sitting in barracks thinking about everything they had lost. Margot volunteered for the infirmary, where she cared for prisoners who fell ill or were injured during work details. The American medical staff treated her with careful courtesy, showing her where supplies were kept, teaching her English medical terms she did not know. The camp physician was Dr. Raymond Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who spoke German because his wife had been born in Munich. He showed Margot how to dress wounds the American way, with supplies she had only dreamed of in France: sulfa powder, penicillin, morphine that came in neat ampules instead of being rationed by the drop. "You were a nurse," he said one morning. It was not a question. "In Hamburg," Margot answered in halting English. "At hospital. Before war." Chen nodded. "You can assist me here if you want to." Whoa. She wanted to. The work gave shape to days that otherwise stretched into emptiness. She learned to understand the American patients who came through, soldiers from the main camp with pneumonia or broken bones or illnesses brought on by the Texas heat. They looked at her with curiosity but not cruelty. Some tried to speak to her in broken German. Most simply nodded and said thank you when she handed them medicine or changed their dressings. The other women found their own rhythms. Some worked in the mess hall, learning to cook American food with ingredients they had never seen. Others did laundry or cleaned barracks or tended a small garden plot where vegetables grew with astonishing speed in the Texas soil. A few taught classes: German literature, mathematics, music. One woman, Hilde Brenner, had been an opera singer in Berlin before the war. She organized a choir that practiced in the recreation hall, their voices rising through the wooden walls into the evening air. Letters arrived from Germany, though not many. The mail had to cross an ocean and pass through censors on both sides. Margot received one letter from her sister in Bremen. The city was in ruins. Food was scarce. People lived in cellars and spoke of survival in days, not years. Klaus was still missing. No one had heard anything. Margot wrote back, though she did not know if her words would ever arrive. She described Texas, the endless sky, the camp that felt nothing like a prison. She did not describe the kindness she had encountered, because she did not think anyone would believe her. Summer arrived with heat that made the German women gasp. The temperature climbed over 100 degrees and stayed there for weeks. The Americans seemed unbothered, moving through the heat as if it were nothing. The Germans learned to rest in the shade during midday, to drink water constantly, to move slowly and deliberately. They learned that Texas had its own form of punishment, one that had nothing to do with guards or fences. In June, something changed. The recreation hall was opened for evening use, and Americans from the main camp were allowed to attend events. The first night, Margot sat with other women and watched as male POWs filed in for a concert. They sat on opposite sides of the hall, Germans on one side, Americans on the other, with guards stationed along the walls. Hilda's choir performed Schubert and Brahms, songs that made the men close their eyes and remember things they thought they had forgotten. After that, the evening concerts became regular events. The segregation softened gradually. Americans brought instruments, guitars, harmonicas, one accordion. They played music that was strange and wonderful, songs about railroads and rivers and places with names like Tennessee and Louisiana. Some Germans learned the words and sang along. Language barriers dissolved in melody. Margot noticed him during the third concert. He was an American guard, younger than most, perhaps 25 or 26. He stood near the back door, not watching the prisoners but watching the music itself, his face showing something like hunger. After the concert ended, he approached her as she was leaving. "You work in the infirmary," he said. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "Yes," Margot answered. "My name is James. James Holloway. I'm from Oklahoma." He paused, searching for words. "I wanted to say thank you. You helped my friend last month when he had that fever." Margot remembered the patient, a young soldier who had been delirious for 3 days. "I do my job," she said simply. "Well, thank you anyway." He nodded and walked away before she could respond. She thought about the encounter as she lay in her bunk that night. He had not looked at her like an enemy. He had looked at her like a person. The distinction seemed small but felt immense. August brought news that changed everything. Colonel Pritchard called an assembly in the recreation hall. The women gathered in nervous silence while he stood at the front with his interpreter. A Red Cross inspection team will visit next week, Pritchard announced. They will assess living conditions, interview prisoners, and ensure compliance with international agreements. You will answer their questions honestly. You will show them your quarters. You will voice any concerns you may have. The women exchanged glances. Red Cross inspections were meant to protect them, but they also meant scrutiny, questions, investigation of anything unusual or irregular. And Margot had something very unusual to hide. After the assembly, she walked back to her barracks with her heart pounding. Her roommate, Elise, a former translator from Munich, noticed immediately. "What is wrong?" she whispered. Margot could not answer. How could she explain that she had been married to an American for 3 months, that the marriage had saved her life, that it was completely, utterly forbidden, and that a Red Cross inspection would expose everything? It had started in May, though the seeds were planted earlier. Margot had been working in the infirmary when a new rule came down from command. Pregnant prisoners would receive additional rations and lighter work assignments in accordance with Geneva Convention protocols. The announcement was routine, administrative, barely noticed. Except Margot was pregnant. She had known for 2 months. The symptoms were unmistakable to someone with her medical training. She had missed her cycle, felt the morning nausea, noticed the subtle changes in her body. But the father was not Klaus. Klaus had been missing for over a year, last seen during the retreat from Russia. The father was Private Thomas Brennan, an American supply clerk who had worked at the camp for 6 months before being transferred to California. It had been brief, desperate, a moment of connection in the midst of isolation. He had been kind to her, bringing extra blankets during a cold snap, teaching her English slang, talking to her like she was human. One evening in the storage room behind the infirmary, kindness had become something more. He had shipped out 2 weeks later. She had not seen him since. Now she carried his child, and that simple fact could destroy everything. German POWs fraternizing with American soldiers was strictly forbidden. The punishment ranged from disciplinary action to court-martial for the Americans and transfer to maximum security facilities for the Germans. If discovered, Margot would be sent somewhere far worse than Camp House. The baby would be born in custody, probably taken away. She would never see her child again. Dr. Chen discovered the pregnancy during a routine examination. He said nothing at first, simply made notes in her file. Later that day, he called her to his office. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. "The father is American, yes?" Margot could not speak. She nodded. Chen studied her for a long moment. "Does he know?" "He is gone. Transferred. So you are alone with this?" "Yes." Chen leaned back in his chair. "Under the rules, you should receive additional care and rations, but reporting this will trigger an investigation. They will want to know who the father is. They will want accountability." "I understand. There is one way to avoid this." Chen's voice was careful, almost clinical. "If you were married to someone here, the pregnancy would be explained. The father would be assumed to be your husband. The Red Cross would have no reason to investigate further. I am married to Klaus, who is missing, presumed dead." Chen pulled out a form. "A marriage certificate filed with camp records would provide cover, but you would need an American to participate, someone willing to claim the child as his." Margot felt the room spin. "You are asking me to find someone who will pretend to be my husband?" "I am telling you what would protect you and your child." Chen stood. "Think about it. You have time before you begin to show, but not much time." She thought about it for 2 weeks. The problem seemed impossible. She needed an American willing to risk court-martial, someone she could trust absolutely, someone with access to the camp records. The list of possibilities was very short. Then she remembered James Holloway. She saw him again at a concert in late May. He stood in his usual place near the back, listening with that same hungry expression. When the music ended, she approached him before she could lose her courage. "Private Holloway," she said. He turned, surprised. "Ma'am, I need speak to you. Private is important." He studied her face and something in his expression shifted. "When?" "Tomorrow, after work, behind infirmary." He nodded slowly. "All right." The next evening, Margot waited in the gathering dusk. Mosquitoes hummed in the air. In the distance, someone played a guitar badly but with enthusiasm. She rehearsed the words in her head, trying to make them sound less desperate than they felt. James appeared at exactly 6 o'clock. He wore civilian clothes instead of his uniform, which meant he was off duty. He looked nervous. "What is this about?" he asked. Margot took a breath. "I am pregnant." He stared at her. "I don't understand." The words came out in a rush, half English, half German, desperate and pleading. She told him about Thomas, about the rules, about the inspection that would come eventually. She told him what Dr. Chen had suggested. She told him she had nowhere else to turn. "You are asking me to claim the child is mine," James said finally. "I ask you pretend to be my husband. For records only, for Red Cross. When they ask questions, you can say we marry before you transfer to this camp. We can say you knew me in Germany. We can say anything. But I need name on paper. I need protection." James was quiet for a long time. Around them, evening sounds filled the air. Crickets, distant voices, the generator humming behind the main building. Finally, he spoke. "Why me?" "Because you are kind. Because you speak to me like person. Because I have no one else. If we get caught, I'll be court-martialed. You'll be sent to a maximum security facility. Maybe worse. I know." He looked at the sky, at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening blue. "Back in Oklahoma, my father ran a dry goods store. Before he died, he told me something. He said the measure of a man is what he does when no one is watching, when the rules don't make sense anymore, when he has to choose between what's legal and what's right." Margot waited. "I think this might be one of those times." James met her eyes. "I'll do it, but we do it properly, not just a piece of paper. We do the ceremony, get the chaplain to witness it, make it real enough that it won't fall apart under scrutiny." "Thank you," Margot whispered. She felt tears on her face. "Thank you." They were married 3 days later in the camp chaplain's office. The chaplain, Father Michael Doherty, was an old Boston Irish priest who had seen enough war to stop asking questions. He performed the ceremony in 10 minutes, speaking the words quickly and quietly. 2 witnesses signed the certificate, Dr. Chen and a supply sergeant who owed James a favor. That evening, Margot became Mrs. James Holloway. She wore her regular clothes. There was no ring, no flowers, no celebration. But the document existed now, filed in the camp records, legal and binding and utterly false. Except it did not feel entirely false. James visited her twice a week after that. Always proper, always respectful. They sat in the recreation hall or walked the perimeter inside the compound, while guards pretended not to notice. He told her about Oklahoma, about the Dust Bowl years, about his mother who still wrote him letters full of gossip and prayer. She told him about Hamburg, about the hospital, about Klaus, who she had loved and lost. They became friends in a way that surprised them both. He brought her books in English, teaching her words she did not know. She taught him simple German phrases, laughing at his pronunciation. The pregnancy progressed, and James attended the medical appointments with her, sitting in Dr. Chen's office like an expectant father, learning about due dates and nutrition and all the ordinary miracles of impending parenthood. In public, they maintained careful distance. But in private moments, something genuine grew between them. Not romance exactly, though Margot sometimes wondered if it might become that. More like partnership, like 2 people building something real from a foundation of desperate necessity. By August, she was 4 months along. The pregnancy was beginning to show, and now the Red Cross inspection was coming, and everything they had built was about to be tested. The inspection was scheduled for August 14th. The camp went into a frenzy of preparation. Barracks were scrubbed until the wood shone. Mess halls were stocked with additional supplies. Documents were organized, schedules were reviewed, and every detail that might reflect poorly on camp administration was addressed with military precision. Margot met with James 3 days before the inspection. They sat in the infirmary after hours, reviewing their story one more time. "We met in France," James said. "I was part of the supply unit that processed prisoners after the Normandy invasion. You were captured in July. We talked during processing. I requested transfer to Housey specifically so I could be near you." "And we marry when?" Margot asked. "May 15th. The chaplain performed the ceremony. Chen and Sergeant Willis were witnesses. The records show everything properly filed. They ask why you marry enemy prisoner?" James smiled slightly. "I tell them you're not my enemy. You're a nurse who helped wounded soldiers. You're a decent person caught in a terrible situation. I fell in love with you. It's not complicated, but it breaks regulations. So did helping escaped slaves before the Civil War. So did sheltering Jews in occupied Europe. Sometimes regulations are wrong." He paused. "If they push back, I tell them to court-martial me if they want, but I'm not abandoning my wife and unborn child." Margot felt something catch in her chest. "You practiced this speech?" "I've been thinking about it for 3 months. He looked at her seriously. "I want you to know something. If this falls apart, if they figure it out, I'll take the blame. I'll say I coerced you, that you had no choice. I'll protect you however I can. James, you cannot." "I can and I will." He stood. "We're in this together now. That's what the vows meant, even if we spoke them for the wrong reasons." After he left, Margot sat alone in the empty infirmary. Outside, the Texas night was alive with sound. She placed one hand on her growing belly and tried to believe that everything would be all right. August 14th arrived with oppressive heat. The temperature climbed past 90 by 9 a.m. and showed no sign of stopping. The Red Cross team arrived at 10, 3 men and 1 woman, all wearing crisp uniforms and serious expressions. They carried clipboards and cameras and an air of bureaucratic authority. Colonel Pritchard met them at the main gate, shaking hands and offering coffee. The inspection began with the male prisoners in the main compound. Margot watched from the infirmary window as the team moved from building to building, taking notes, asking questions, photographing everything. They reached the women's compound at 2 p.m. The heat was brutal by then, turning the air thick and difficult to breathe. Margot stood with the other women in the recreation hall, waiting while the team conducted their initial assessment. The lead inspector was a Swiss man named Gerhard Fischer, middle-aged and precise in his movements. He reviewed documents first, checking rosters against actual prisoners, verifying that everyone was accounted for. Then he began individual interviews. They called Margot at 3:30. She entered the administrative office where Fischer sat behind a desk, flanked by his team. The female inspector, a Norwegian woman named Christine Olin, smiled at her encouragingly. "Please sit," Fischer said in German. Margot sat. Her hands were sweating. "We have some questions about your situation here." Fischer opened a file. "You are Margot Werner, yes? Age 32, captured in France, transferred here in March?" "Yes, sir." "And you work in the camp infirmary?" "Yes, sir." Fischer made a note. "I see from medical records that you are pregnant. Approximately 4 months?" Margot's throat went dry. "Yes, sir." "The father?" "My husband." Fischer looked up. "You are married?" "Yes, sir. To Private James Holloway, American soldier stationed here." The room went silent. Fischer exchanged glances with his team. "This is highly irregular." "Yes, sir. When did this marriage occur?" "May 15th. In the camp chapel." The chaplain performed the ceremony. "You understand that fraternization between prisoners and guards is forbidden?" "I understand it is discouraged. But it is not illegal. Private Holloway and I were married with proper authorization." The chaplain witnessed it. The documents are filed with the camp administration. Fischer leaned back. "I will need to interview your husband to verify this." "Of course. And I will need to see the marriage certificate. Dr. Chen has a copy in the medical files." Fischer made more notes. "How did you meet Private Holloway?" Margot recited the story they had prepared, keeping her voice steady. France, prisoner processing, transfer request. She made it sound routine, almost boring. Fisher listened without expression. This is still extremely unusual, he said finally. But if the paperwork is in order, and both parties confirm the same story, I see no immediate violation. He looked at her directly. Are you being coerced in any way? Are you being mistreated? No, sir. My husband is very kind to me, and the pregnancy was wanted. Margot hesitated, then decided on honesty. The pregnancy was unexpected, but the baby is wanted. Very much. Fisher closed the file. I will interview Private Holloway this evening. If his account matches yours, and if the documentation is legitimate, we will note the marriage in our report but take no further action. He paused. I hope for your sake that everything is as you say. It is, sir. She was dismissed. Walking back to the barracks, Margot felt her legs shaking. Elise caught her arm at the door. What happened? They know about James. They are going to interview him. God help us, Elise whispered. James was called at 7 p.m. He had spent the afternoon preparing, reviewing the story in his mind, steeling himself for interrogation. He entered the administrative office to find Fisher and his team waiting with expressions that gave nothing away. Private Holloway, Fisher began. Please sit. James sat. I have been speaking with your wife. James kept his face neutral. Yes, sir. She tells me you met in France during prisoner processing, that you requested transfer to Camp House to be near her, that you married in May with the chaplain's authorization. Fisher watched him closely. Is this accurate? Yes, sir. Completely accurate. You understand that your relationship violates standard military protocol regarding prisoner interactions. With respect, sir, we researched the regulations extensively. There is no explicit prohibition against marriage between a soldier and a POW, provided the marriage is consensual and properly documented. We followed all procedures. The chaplain approved it. The camp commander was informed. Were you aware your wife was pregnant when you married? No, sir. We learned that in June. And your intention now? My intention is to honor my vows. Margot is my wife. The child is my responsibility. When the war ends and she is released, I will bring her to Oklahoma. We will build a life together. Fisher studied him for a long moment. You realize this will likely end your military career. I realize it will complicate things. James met his eyes. But I've seen enough of this war to know what matters. Following every regulation doesn't matter. Doing right by the people you love does. Even when those people are technically your enemy. Margot was never my enemy. She's a nurse. She saved American lives while working in that infirmary. She's a good person who got caught up in something larger than herself. James paused. I know this is irregular. I know it looks suspicious, but I swear to you on my mother's grave that every word I've told you is true. Fisher made notes. I will need to verify your story with the chaplain and review all documentation. Of course, sir. James was dismissed. He walked out into the evening heat and found Margot waiting near the barracks. She looked terrified. How did it go? She whispered. I told them the truth. He managed a smile, or at least our version of it. What happens now? We wait. The Red Cross team spent the next day reviewing documents. Father Daugherty confirmed the marriage ceremony. Dr. Chen provided medical records. Sergeant Willis verified his role as witness. Every piece of paper they had prepared was examined, cross-referenced, analyzed for inconsistencies. Fisher called them both to his office on August 16th. They sat side by side while he reviewed his notes. I have completed my investigation, Fisher said finally. The documentation appears legitimate. The marriage was performed according to proper procedure. Both parties confirmed the same story with consistent details. He looked at them over his glasses. However, I must tell you that this situation is without precedent. The Red Cross will note the marriage in our report with a recommendation that military authorities review the propriety of the arrangement. What does that mean? James asked. It means you may face a formal inquiry when this report reaches headquarters. It means your commanding officer will have questions. It means this is not over. But you will not separate us? Margot's voice shook. Fisher's expression softened slightly. The Red Cross's mandate is to ensure humane treatment of prisoners of war. Separating a pregnant woman from her legal husband would violate that mandate. He closed his folder. Your marriage will stand, for now. They walked out together into the afternoon sun. Neither spoke until they were away from the administrative building. We did it, James said quietly. Margot leaned against the barracks wall. I cannot believe it worked. He put his arm around her shoulders, the first time he had touched her in weeks. For a moment they stood together in the heat, two people who had built something impossible and somehow made it real. The inquiry came in September. James was called before a review board at the division headquarters in Fort Worth. He testified for 3 hours, answering the same questions repeatedly, defending choices that felt increasingly justified the more he explained them. The board concluded that while his actions were highly irregular, they did not constitute a court-martial offense. He received a formal reprimand, was removed from guard duty, and reassigned to supply management, where he would have no direct contact with prisoners. But he could still visit Margot. The marriage remained valid, the baby remained protected. By October, the pregnancy was obvious. Margot moved carefully now, one hand often resting on her belly where the child kicked and turned. Other women in the compound knitted small clothes and blankets. Dr. Chen monitored her health weekly. James came every evening, bringing books and conversation and a steadiness that Margot had not known she needed. They talked about the future in those evening conversations, about Oklahoma, where James would take her when the war ended, about the farm his cousin owned, where they could live until they found their own place, about raising the child in a world that was not at war, that did not see them as enemies. One evening in November, Margot asked the question that had haunted her for months. Do you regret this? Helping me? James thought for a long time. Finally, he shook his head. No, I regret that we had to lie. I regret that circumstances forced your hand. But I don't regret knowing you. I don't regret being part of this. You saved my life. Maybe, or maybe you saved mine. He smiled slightly. I was going through this war like a ghost, following orders, not questioning anything. You made me think about what matters beyond the rules. That's worth something. The baby came in January 1945. A girl born in the camp infirmary with Dr. Chen attending, and James pacing outside like any expectant father. When Chen brought the infant out, wrapped in a blanket that one of the German women had made, James held her with shaking hands. She's beautiful, he whispered. Margot named her Anna, after her grandmother. Anna Holloway, American by birth, German by heritage, living proof that even in the midst of war, human connection could transcend borders and regulations and everything that tried to keep people apart. The war in Europe ended in May. The women's compound at Camp House began emptying as prisoners were repatriated. But Margot did not return to Germany. She was married to an American citizen. She had an American child. She had rights now, protections, a future that did not involve ruins and starvation and a husband who had probably died in Russia. James was discharged in July. He returned to Oklahoma with Margot and Anna, moving into a small house on his cousin's property outside Tulsa. The neighbors stared at first, suspicious of the German woman with the broken English and the baby who looked too American to be enemy spawn. But Margot had survived worse than suspicious neighbors. She learned to cook American food, to understand American humor, to navigate this strange country that had become her home. Years later, when Anna was old enough to understand, they told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. They told her about the camp, about the Red Cross inspection, about the desperate choice that had brought them together. They told her that sometimes family is not about blood, but about choosing to stand beside someone when the world says you should not. Anna grew up in Oklahoma, graduated from the state university, became a teacher. She married a man from Kansas and had 3 children of her own. James and Margot lived to see their grandchildren, to watch them grow up in a world that remembered the war but was no longer consumed by it. James died first in 1989 of heart failure. He was 70 years old, At the funeral, Margot stood beside the grave and remembered the evening behind the infirmary when she had asked an impossible thing from a stranger. She remembered his answer, the quiet courage it took to say yes. Margot lived another decade, passing in 1999 at the age of 87. In her final months, she told Anna stories she had never shared before. About Hamburg before the war, about Klaus, her first husband, who she had loved and mourned and never forgotten. About Thomas Brennan, the father Anna had never known, who had given her life but could not give her a family. And about James Holloway, who had given her everything else. The marriage certificate still exists, so filed in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Researchers who study prisoner of war camps occasionally find it and pause, puzzled by the unusual documentation. A German POW married to an American guard. A pregnancy that should have caused scandal, but instead became just another administrative note. The Red Cross report from August 1944 is there too, noting the marriage with Swiss precision and recommending review. No record exists of what happened after that review. The bureaucracy moved on to other concerns. The war ended. People went home. But in Oklahoma, in a small cemetery outside Tulsa, two graves sit side by side. James Holloway, Margot Holloway. The dates on their stones span different worlds. His beginning in rural Oklahoma during the Depression, hers in urban Hamburg before the war. But they end in the same place, separated by only 10 years, bound together by choice and circumstance and a moment when a desperate woman asked an impossible thing. "Please, American sir, pretend to be my husband." And he did. Not for a day or an inspection, but for a lifetime. Not because regulations required it, but because sometimes the measure of a person is what they do when no one is watching, when the rules stop making sense, when they must choose between what is legal and what is right. He chose right. And in that choice, two lives that should never have intersected built something that lasted beyond war, beyond nations, beyond everything that tried to keep them apart. The story is true. The names have been changed, but the core of it remains. In Texas, during the strangest war, a German woman asked an American soldier to pretend to be her husband. And he said yes, and meant it, and made it real.